She's becoming such a burden, John. I can't keep doing this. Those words from my daughter-in-law Karen cut through me like a surgeon's blade as I lay in my hospital bed, pretending to be asleep. What they didn't know was that while they saw me as a financial drain, I had been quietly maintaining a Swiss bank account worth $2.8 million for the past 30 years. Money I'd kept hidden through decades of family drama, waiting for exactly this moment when I'd need my independence most. My name is Dolly Parks, and at 74 years old. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had just undergone emergency gallbladder surgery that left me weak, disoriented, and apparently completely disposable to the people I'd spent my entire life caring for. The surgery had been unexpected. A routine doctor's visit turned into an emergency room dash, when what I thought was indigestion revealed itself to be a severely inflamed gallbladder requiring immediate removal. One moment I was tending to my garden at my modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street. The next I was being wheeled into an operating room with my son John Holland, frantically calling my other children. Now 3 days post-surgery, my hospital room had become a conference center, where my family discussed my future, as if I were a piece of furniture to be rearranged rather than a human being with her own thoughts and preferences. John, my eldest at 52, stood at the foot of my bed wearing his perpetually serious expression, the same look he'd worn since he was 8 years old and appointed himself the family's unofficial supervisor. His wife Karen, perfectly coiffed even at 10 in the morning, scrolled through her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems through delegation. The doctor says she'll need at least 6 weeks of recovery, John announced to his siblings, speaking about me in third person despite my being right there. She can't climb stairs, can't drive, and certainly can't live alone in that house with all those steps. My daughter Laura, 48 and eternally anxious, wrung her hands from her position near the window. But John, we all work full-time. Henry travels constantly for his consulting business, and I have the kids' activities every single day. How can we possibly— Exactly my point, Karen interrupted, finally looking up from her device. This is why I researched assisted living facilities this morning. Sunset Manor has an opening in their intermediate care wing. It's clean, professional, and they handle all the medical supervision she'll need. I felt my chest tighten, though whether from post-surgical pain or pure rage I couldn't tell. Sunset Manor, I'd visited that sterile warehouse of forgotten elderly people exactly once, when my neighbor had been placed there against her will. The smell of disinfectant couldn't mask the underlying odor of despair that permeated every corridor. My youngest, Henry, finally spoke up from his corner chair. At 45, he'd always been the peacekeeper, though his version of peace usually meant avoiding conflict rather than addressing it. Maybe we should ask Mom what she wants. Oh, Henry, Laura sighed with the exasperated tone she'd perfected as the middle child. You know how stubborn she gets. She'll insist she can manage alone, but look at her. She can barely sit up without help. It was true that I was weak. The anesthesia had hit me harder than expected, and the incision across my abdomen made every movement a careful calculation. But my mind was perfectly clear, and what I was hearing crystallized 30 years of family dynamics into this one brutal moment. Karen resumed her research aloud. Sunset Manor offers 3 meal plans, housekeeping services, and 24-hour nursing supervision. The cost is $3,200 per month, but if we sell her house, that should cover at least the first few years. Sell my house. The words escaped before I could stop them, my voice cracked and weak but unmistakably furious. All 4 of them turned toward me with expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance, as if they'd forgotten I was capable of speech. Mom, you're awake, John said, his tone carrying more resignation than relief. We're just discussing practical arrangements for your recovery. Practical arrangements, I repeated slowly, struggling to push myself higher against the pillows. Like selling my home and warehousing me in a nursing facility, without bothering to ask what I might want? Mother, please. Laura moved closer, her voice taking on the condescending sweetness she'd used since childhood, when she wanted to avoid unpleasant conversations. We're trying to do what's best for you. You can't possibly manage that big house with stairs and your garden and all those responsibilities. It's a 2-bedroom ranch, I pointed out, and I've been managing it perfectly well for the past 15 years since your father died. Karen made an impatient sound. That was before major surgery, Dolly. Before you became, she paused, clearly searching for a diplomatically cruel phrase, dependent on others for basic care. The word dependent hung in the air like a toxic cloud. This was the crux of it, not concern for my well-being, but annoyance at the inconvenience I represented to their carefully organized lives. I studied my children's faces, really looked at them perhaps for the first time in years. John, who had inherited his father's authoritarian streak and sense of financial superiority. Laura, perpetually overwhelmed by her own choices but quick to make decisions for others. Henry, well-meaning but ultimately passive when strength was needed. And Karen, the daughter-in-law who had spent 20 years tolerating family obligations while clearly viewing them as obstacles to her preferred lifestyle. These were the people I had sacrificed for, worried about, supported through every crisis and celebration for decades. And now that I needed support in return, their immediate response was to efficiently dispose of me in the most cost-effective manner possible. But what they didn't know, what none of them had ever known, was that I had been preparing for exactly this scenario since 1993, when I first recognized the particular brand of conditional love my family specialized in. The morning after that first devastating conversation, I woke to find my family had returned with reinforcements. Karen's sister Lynette sat primly in the visitor's chair, her tablet open to what appeared to be a spreadsheet. I recognized the look. This was a family intervention disguised as a planning session. "Good morning, Mrs. Parks," Lynette said, with professional cheerfulness. "Karen asked me to help with the logistics since I handled my mother's transition into care last year." The word transition made my stomach clench. In my experience, when families started using euphemisms, someone was about to lose their autonomy. John cleared his throat importantly. "Mom, we've done some research overnight. We need to discuss your situation realistically." "My situation," I repeated, noting how I had become a situations rather than a person. "The medical facts," Karen interjected, pulling out a printed document. "Dr. Nathaniel was very clear about your limitations. 6 weeks minimum recovery, no lifting over 5 pounds, assistance required for basic activities of daily living." I wanted to point out that Dr. Nathaniel had been speaking about temporary restrictions, not permanent incapacity, but Laura jumped in before I could speak. "Mom, we love you, but we have to be honest about our capabilities too. I have soccer practice 4 days a week with Emma, and Dylan's robotics team meets twice weekly. My schedule is completely packed until summer. And I have the Morrison account launch next month," Henry added apologetically. "I'll be traveling to Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco over the next 6 weeks. The timing couldn't be worse." I noticed that none of them had asked about my preferences or explored alternatives. They had simply decided that their schedules were immutable, while my life was completely flexible. "What about hiring someone to help me at home?" I suggested. "A visiting nurse or home health aide." Karen and Lynette exchanged a look that conveyed volumes. "Mrs. Parks," Lynette said gently, "that's extremely expensive. Quality home care runs about $200 per day. Over 6 weeks you're looking at $8,000 minimum. Plus," Karen added, "your house isn't set up for someone with mobility limitations. The front steps, the narrow hallways, that old bathroom with the high tub, it's honestly not safe." John nodded gravely. "We've looked at your finances, Mom. Dad's pension, your Social Security, the small savings account. It's enough to cover basic living expenses, but not luxury care options." The phrase "looked at your finances" hit me like a physical blow. When had they accessed my bank records? How had they obtained information about accounts I had never given them permission to review? "You went through my financial records?" I asked, my voice sharper than intended. "Mom, please," Laura said, clearly uncomfortable. "John is your power of attorney for financial matters. Dad set that up years ago, remember? We were just being responsible, making sure we understood the full picture." I did remember signing those documents, back when John had presented them as simple estate planning paperwork. Harold had been declining then, and it had seemed prudent to have legal safeguards in place. I had never imagined my son would use that authority to investigate my finances while I was recovering from surgery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The reality is, Karen continued, Sunset Manor is actually the most economical option. Your house is worth about $180,000 according to Zillow, and it's been sitting on a good-sized lot in a desirable neighborhood. Even after realtor fees and closing costs, that would cover almost 5 years of care. 5 years, I repeated numbly. They had already calculated how long I was expected to live. Of course, we hope you'll be with us much longer than that, Henry said quickly, sensing my distress. But it's important to plan for different scenarios. Lynette consulted her tablet. I've scheduled tours at 3 facilities this afternoon: Sunset Manor, Garden View Assisted Living, and Peaceful Acres. They all have different amenities and price points. You scheduled tours without asking me. Mom, John said with strained patience. You're not exactly in condition to be running around town looking at places. We thought we'd do the preliminary research, narrow down the options, then bring you the best choices. The best choices. As if I were a child being offered a selection of acceptable cereals rather than an adult being stripped of the right to make fundamental decisions about my own life. I don't want to live in any of those places, I said clearly. I want to go home. That's not realistic, Karen replied with the tone someone might use to explain to a toddler why they couldn't have ice cream for breakfast. You're being emotional right now, which is completely understandable, but we need to make practical decisions based on facts, not feelings. What about what I want? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Don't my feelings matter at all? Of course they matter, Laura said soothingly. But sometimes we have to accept that what we want isn't what's best for us. You always taught us that, remember? The manipulation was breathtaking. They were using my own parenting advice to justify overriding my autonomy as an adult. Besides, John added, you'll make friends at these places. They have activities, social programs, even little outings. It might be good for you to be around people your own age, instead of sitting alone in that house all day. I wanted to point out that I had never been lonely in my house, that I had friends, hobbies, a life they apparently knew nothing about. But I realized that explaining would be futile. They had already decided who I was and what I needed. The tours are at 2, 3:30 and 4:15, Lynette announced. We should have enough information to make a decision by tomorrow. Make a decision. Not help me make a decision, but make one on my behalf. As they filed out, chattering about logistics and timelines, I lay in my hospital bed staring at the ceiling. 30 years of family gatherings, birthday celebrations, holiday traditions, and this was what it came down to: efficient disposal of an inconvenient burden. But they had made one crucial mistake in their assessment of my finances. They had found the small local savings account, the modest checking account, the predictable pension payments. What they hadn't found, because they hadn't known to look for it, was the account I had opened in 1993, after the first time I realized that my family's love came with conditions. It was time to make a phone call. That evening, after the nursing staff had completed their rounds and the hospital corridors had settled into nighttime quiet, I gathered what little strength I had and attempted to reason with my children one more time. I had asked them to return after dinner, hoping that a calmer setting might lead to a more productive conversation. I appreciate that you're all concerned about me, I began, choosing my words carefully, but I think there might be some middle ground we haven't explored. John sat forward in his chair, his expression already showing the patient tolerance he reserved for conversations he considered pointless. Mom, we've been over this. The doctors were very clear about your limitations. Temporary limitations, I corrected. Doctor, Nathaniel said 6 weeks for full recovery. That's not permanent disability. But what if something happens during those 6 weeks? Laura asked, wringing her hands. What if you fall? What if you have complications? You'd be all alone in that house with no one to help you. I had prepared for this objection. I've been thinking about that. Mrs. Dench next door has offered to check on me daily. She's retired, she's reliable, and she's been a good neighbor for 8 years, and there are medical alert systems now. Mrs. Dench is 79 years old. Karen interrupted dismissively. She's hardly qualified to provide medical supervision. I'm not asking her to provide medical supervision, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I'm asking her to be a friendly neighbor who makes sure I'm okay. There's a difference. Henry, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Mom, what about grocery shopping? Cooking? Cleaning? You can't do any of those things right now. There are grocery delivery services. I could hire a cleaning service once a week. For cooking, there are meal delivery programs specifically designed for people recovering from surgery. I had actually researched these options on my phone during the long hospital afternoon. But I could see from their faces that they viewed my preparations as further evidence of my inability to face reality. Do you have any idea how much all of that costs? John asked, his tone becoming sharper. Mom, we've seen your finances. You're living on a fixed income. You can't afford to hire services for everything. Maybe I could help with some of the costs, I offered, though I knew this was dangerous territory. I have some savings you might not be aware of. What savings? Karen demanded immediately. We've reviewed all your accounts. There's the checking account with $1,500, the savings account with about $8,000, and the small CD that matured last year. That's it. The speed and certainty of her response told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly they had investigated my financial situation. But it also revealed how little they actually knew. I might have some resources you haven't seen, I said carefully. Mom, Laura said with exaggerated patience. You're not thinking clearly. The medication, the stress, the surgery. It's all affecting your judgment. You're imagining resources that don't exist. I'm not imagining anything, I replied, my voice growing stronger despite my physical weakness. I'm telling you that I have options you haven't considered, such as, John challenged. This was the moment I had been dreading. I couldn't reveal the Swiss account, not yet, not like this, but I needed to make them understand that their assumptions about my helplessness were wrong. I could take out a home equity loan, I said, grasping for alternatives. The house is paid off, and you said yourself it's worth $180,000. I could borrow against it to pay for home care. The silence that followed was deafening. Then John began to laugh, not with humor, but with the kind of bitter amusement that accompanied profound disappointment. Mom, you're 74 years old. No bank is going to give you a 30-year mortgage, and even if they did, you'd be paying it off until you're over 100 years old. That's not a solution. That's financial suicide. There are other options, I insisted, though I was running out of conventional alternatives. Reverse mortgages, for instance. Reverse mortgages are predatory, Karen said flatly. They're designed to strip equity from elderly homeowners who don't understand the fine print. I would never let you sign something like that. Let me. The phrase hung in the air like a declaration of war. Karen had just made it clear that she believed she had the authority to prevent me from making my own financial decisions. I'm still legally competent, I said quietly. I can make my own choices about my own property. Can you? John asked, his voice taking on a tone I had never heard before. Cold, calculating, almost threatening. Because if you're talking about taking on massive debt at your age, making irrational financial decisions, maybe we need to reconsider your competency status. The threat was unmistakable. If I continued to resist their plans, they would pursue legal guardianship and have me declared mentally incompetent. The power of attorney documents I had signed years ago suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. That's not necessary, Henry said quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Mom, nobody wants to take away your independence. We just want to keep you safe. Safe, I repeated, by selling my home and placing me in an institution against my will. It's not an institution, Laura protested. These are modern facilities with excellent care and social opportunities. You might actually enjoy it once you adjust. And if I don't want to adjust? Mom, John said with finality. Sometimes we don't get to choose our circumstances. Sometimes we have to accept what life gives us and make the best of it. I stared at my eldest son, this man I had raised from infancy, and realized that somewhere along the way he had become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could look at his mother and see only a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. I see, I said quietly. So my choices are to accept your plan willingly, or have it imposed on me legally. It doesn't have to be adversarial, Karen said with false sweetness. We're all on the same team here. We all want what's best for you. But as I looked around the room at their faces, John's stern authority, Karen's impatient efficiency, Laura's anxious guilt, Henry's uncomfortable compliance, I realized that what they wanted was not what was best for me. What they wanted was the easiest solution for them. I need to think about this, I said finally. There's nothing to think about, John replied. The decision is made. We've scheduled the tours for tomorrow, and we'll make our choice by Friday. You'll be discharged on Saturday, and we'll move you directly to whichever facility we select. As they gathered their coats and bags, preparing to leave me alone with the consequences of their decisions, I made my own choice. I would not be spending my remaining years warehoused in a facility, dependent on the charity of children who saw me as a burden. It was time to call Switzerland. It was time to make a phone call. That evening, after the nursing staff had completed their rounds and the hospital corridors had settled into nighttime quiet, I gathered what little strength I had and attempted to reason with my children one more time. I had asked them to return after dinner, hoping that a calmer setting might lead to a more productive conversation. I appreciate that you're all concerned about me, I began, choosing my words carefully, but I think there might be some middle ground we haven't explored. John sat forward in his chair, his expression already showing the patient tolerance he reserved for conversations he considered pointless. Mom, we've been over this. The doctors were very clear about your limitations. Temporary limitations, I corrected. Doctor, Nathaniel said 6 weeks for full recovery. That's not permanent disability. But what if something happens during those 6 weeks? Laura asked, wringing her hands. What if you fall? What if you have complications? You'd be all alone in that house with no one to help you. I had prepared for this objection. I've been thinking about that. Mrs. Dench next door has offered to check on me daily. She's retired, she's reliable, and she's been a good neighbor for 8 years, and there are medical alert systems now. Mrs. Dench is 79 years old. Karen interrupted dismissively. She's hardly qualified to provide medical supervision. I'm not asking her to provide medical supervision, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I'm asking her to be a friendly neighbor who makes sure I'm okay. There's a difference. Henry, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Mom, what about grocery shopping? Cooking? Cleaning? You can't do any of those things right now. There are grocery delivery services. I could hire a cleaning service once a week. For cooking, there are meal delivery programs specifically designed for people recovering from surgery. I had actually researched these options on my phone during the long hospital afternoon. But I could see from their faces that they viewed my preparations as further evidence of my inability to face reality. Do you have any idea how much all of that costs? John asked, his tone becoming sharper. Mom, we've seen your finances. You're living on a fixed income. You can't afford to hire services for everything. Maybe I could help with some of the costs, I offered, though I knew this was dangerous territory. I have some savings you might not be aware of. What savings? Karen demanded immediately. We've reviewed all your accounts. There's the checking account with $1,500, the savings account with about $8,000, and the small CD that matured last year. That's it. The speed and certainty of her response told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly they had investigated my financial situation. But it also revealed how little they actually knew. I might have some resources you haven't seen, I said carefully. Mom, Laura said with exaggerated patience. You're not thinking clearly. The medication, the stress, the surgery. It's all affecting your judgment. You're imagining resources that don't exist. I'm not imagining anything, I replied, my voice growing stronger despite my physical weakness. I'm telling you that I have options you haven't considered, such as, John challenged. This was the moment I had been dreading. I couldn't reveal the Swiss account, not yet, not like this, but I needed to make them understand that their assumptions about my helplessness were wrong. I could take out a home equity loan, I said, grasping for alternatives. The house is paid off, and you said yourself it's worth $180,000. I could borrow against it to pay for home care. The silence that followed was deafening. Then John began to laugh, not with humor, but with the kind of bitter amusement that accompanied profound disappointment. Mom, you're 74 years old. No bank is going to give you a 30-year mortgage, and even if they did, you'd be paying it off until you're over 100 years old. That's not a solution. That's financial suicide. There are other options, I insisted, though I was running out of conventional alternatives. Reverse mortgages, for instance. Reverse mortgages are predatory, Karen said flatly. They're designed to strip equity from elderly homeowners who don't understand the fine print. I would never let you sign something like that. Let me. The phrase hung in the air like a declaration of war. Karen had just made it clear that she believed she had the authority to prevent me from making my own financial decisions. I'm still legally competent, I said quietly. I can make my own choices about my own property. Can you? John asked, his voice taking on a tone I had never heard before. Cold, calculating, almost threatening. Because if you're talking about taking on massive debt at your age, making irrational financial decisions, maybe we need to reconsider your competency status. The threat was unmistakable. If I continued to resist their plans, they would pursue legal guardianship and have me declared mentally incompetent. The power of attorney documents I had signed years ago suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. That's not necessary, Henry said quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Mom, nobody wants to take away your independence. We just want to keep you safe. Safe, I repeated, by selling my home and placing me in an institution against my will. It's not an institution, Laura protested. These are modern facilities with excellent care and social opportunities. You might actually enjoy it once you adjust. And if I don't want to adjust? Mom, John said with finality, sometimes we don't get to choose our circumstances. Sometimes we have to accept what life gives us and make the best of it. I stared at my eldest son, this man I had raised from infancy, and realized that somewhere along the way he had become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could look at his mother and see only a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I see, I said quietly. So my choices are to accept your plan willingly, or have it imposed on me legally. It doesn't have to be adversarial, Karen said with false sweetness. We're all on the same team here. We all want what's best for you. But as I looked around the room at their faces, John's stern authority, Karen's impatient efficiency, Laura's anxious guilt, Henry's uncomfortable compliance, I realized that what they wanted was not what was best for me. What they wanted was the easiest solution for them. I need to think about this, I said finally. There's nothing to think about, John replied. The decision is made. We've scheduled the tours for tomorrow, and we'll make our choice by Friday. You'll be discharged on Saturday, and we'll move you directly to whichever facility we select. As they gathered their coats and bags, preparing to leave me alone with the consequences of their decisions, I made my own choice. I would not be spending my remaining years warehoused in a facility, dependent on the charity of children who saw me as a burden. It was time to call Switzerland. The next morning, I waited until the hospital settled into its mid-morning lull before making the call that would change everything. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed the international number I had memorized 30 years ago, but had never expected to use under these circumstances. Guten Morgen, Banque Privée Geneva. This is Kurt speaking. How may I assist you? The familiar Swiss-accented English brought back a flood of memories from 1993, when I had first walked into that marble-floored banking hall in Geneva, clutching Harold's life insurance payment that my family had never known about. "This is Dolly Parks," I said quietly, glancing toward the hospital room door. "Account number 4789, she 2847. There was a brief pause as Kurt accessed my information. "Mrs. Parks, it's been quite some time since we've heard from you. How may we help you today?" "I need to make some arrangements," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I may need to access my funds and possibly relocate to Switzerland." "Of course. Let me pull up your current balance, Mrs. Parks. Your account shows $2,847,612 as of this morning. Would you like me to explain the recent growth from your investment portfolio?" Even after all these years, hearing that number spoken aloud made my heart race. What had started as a $20,000 life insurance payout had grown exponentially through careful Swiss investment management and compound interest over 3 decades. "That won't be necessary right now," I said, though part of me was curious about the investments I had barely thought about for years. "I need to know about the logistics of relocating to Switzerland as a retiree." "Ah yes, we assist many clients with retirement relocations. Are you familiar with the Swiss retirement visa program?" I wasn't, but I had 6 weeks to learn. "Please explain." "For individuals with significant financial resources, Switzerland offers a residence permit based on a lump sum taxation agreement. Given your account balance, you would easily qualify. The process typically takes 2 to 3 months, but we can expedite certain aspects." As Kurt explained the requirements, proof of financial independence, health insurance, housing arrangements, I felt a spark of hope I hadn't experienced in days. This wasn't just a fantasy, it was a genuine possibility. "I would need assistance with housing," I said. "Something suitable for someone recovering from surgery." "Absolutely. We work with a relocation service that specializes in luxury retirement accommodations. There are beautiful properties available in Montreux, Lucerne, and the Bernese Oberland, all with full medical support services if needed." Medical support services, professional, dignified care in a beautiful setting, paid for with my own money, rather than grudgingly provided by children who saw me as a burden. "I'll need to think about this," I said, though my mind was already made up. "How quickly could you begin the preliminary paperwork?" "I can start the process immediately. We'll need some documentation from you, but much of the initial work can be done remotely. Shall I have our relocation specialist contact you?" "Not yet," I said quickly. "I need to handle some family matters first, but please begin the paperwork. I'll call you back within the week." After ending the call, I sat in my hospital bed staring out at the gray October sky, feeling more empowered than I had in years. For the first time since the surgery, I had options that didn't depend on my children's approval or convenience. But my moment of peace was interrupted by raised voices in the hallway. Through the thin door, I could hear Karen talking to someone in the urgent, frustrated tone she used when things weren't going according to her plans. "We've scheduled tours at 3 facilities this afternoon," she was saying. "The paperwork needs to be ready so we can move her directly from the hospital on Saturday." "I understand your urgency," came an unfamiliar voice, "but Mrs. Parks has the right to refuse placement. We can't force her to sign admission papers." I recognized the voice now. It was Janet, the hospital social worker, who had been assigned to coordinate my discharge planning. Apparently, my family had been trying to streamline the process by having the legal paperwork prepared in advance. "She's not thinking clearly," John's voice joined the conversation. "The medication, the trauma of surgery, she's not capable of making rational decisions right now." "Mr. Holland," Janet replied patiently, "I've spoken with your mother several times. She's alert, oriented, and demonstrating appropriate decision-making capacity. Unless you have a court order declaring her incompetent, she has the right to make her own choices about her living situation. But she's talking about impossible things." Laura's voice was higher than usual, tinged with anxiety. "She mentioned home equity loans and reverse mortgages. She's clearly confused about her financial situation." "Perhaps," Janet said diplomatically. But confusion about financial options doesn't constitute legal incompetence. Many elderly patients explore various alternatives when facing major life transitions. I heard footsteps approaching my door and quickly closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. The conversation moved past my room, but I had heard enough to understand that Janet was my unexpected ally in this battle. 20 minutes later, she knocked on my doorframe. "Mrs. Parks, may I come in?" I opened my eyes and smiled at her. Janet was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the practical air of someone who had seen every family dynamic imaginable. "I couldn't help but overhear your family's concerns," she said, closing the door behind her. "I wanted to check in with you about your discharge preferences." "They want to place me in a nursing home," I said simply. "I don't want to go." "You have the right to refuse," Janet said firmly. "But I need to ask, do you have realistic alternatives? Your family seems to believe you can't safely live alone right now." This was the moment of truth. I could continue to appear helpless and dependent, or I could reveal just enough of my resources to establish my credibility without exposing the full extent of my financial independence. "I have some savings they don't know about," I said carefully. "Enough to hire private care and support services." Janet nodded without surprise. "That's more common than you might think. Many elderly people maintain separate resources for exactly these situations. Are you comfortable telling me more about your options?" I took a deep breath. "I have access to significantly more money than my family realizes. Enough to hire full-time care, modify my home if necessary, or even relocate somewhere with better support services." "Relocate?" Janet's eyebrows rose slightly. "Somewhere local, or possibly overseas," I said, watching her reaction. "I have some international banking relationships that might facilitate that." To her credit, Janet didn't look skeptical or concerned about my mental state. She simply nodded and made a note in her file. "Mrs. Parks, I think you and I should have a longer conversation about your options. Your family is well-meaning, but they may not have all the information they need to make the best decisions for you." As Janet left, promising to return the next morning for a more detailed discussion, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. I had an ally, I had resources, and I had a plan. My family thought they were managing a helpless old woman with limited options. Tomorrow, they would begin to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, I woke to find my hospital room filled with the controlled chaos of my family's facility tours. Karen had arrived early with a clipboard, color-coded folders, and what appeared to be a rating system for the nursing homes they had visited. "Good morning, Mom," John said, his tone artificially cheerful. "We have some wonderful options to discuss with you." "Sunset Manor scored highest on our evaluation," Karen announced, spreading glossy brochures across my bedside table. "They have immediate availability, excellent medical staff, and a very reasonable monthly rate." I looked at the brochures with their stock photos of smiling elderly residents engaged in arts and crafts, and felt a familiar surge of claustrophobia. "I told you I don't want to go to any of these places." "Mom, please," Laura said, settling into the visitor's chair with a sigh. "We've spent 2 days researching the best options. These are quality facilities with professional care." "I don't need professional care," I replied. "I need time to recover in familiar surroundings." "That's not realistic," Henry said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We've been over this." I had been dreading this moment, but I realized it was time to play the card I had been holding in reserve. "Actually, I've made other arrangements." The room fell silent. Karen's pen stopped moving across her clipboard. John's expression shifted from artificial cheerfulness to sharp attention. "What kind of arrangements?" he asked slowly. "I've hired a private care service," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They'll provide round-the-clock support for as long as I need it." "With what money?" Karen demanded immediately. "We've reviewed your finances, Dolly. You can't afford private care." "I have resources you haven't seen," I repeated, watching their faces carefully. "More than enough to cover my care costs." John stood up abruptly. "Mom, this is exactly what we were worried about. You're making irrational decisions based on financial fantasy. You don't have hidden money." "Don't I?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could see the doubt creeping into their expressions, the first crack in their certainty about my helplessness. "Prove it," Karen said bluntly. I had anticipated this moment. Slowly I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had memorized the day before. The room remained silent as the international connection went through. Guten Tag, Bank Privé Geneva. This is Kurt speaking. I put the phone on speaker, watching my family's faces as they heard the Swiss-accented English. This is Dolly Parks, I said clearly. Could you please confirm my current account balance for my family? Of course, Mrs. Parks. Your account shows $2,847,612 as of this morning. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's clipboard slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. Laura's mouth opened and closed without sound. Henry stared at the phone as if it were speaking a foreign language. Only John managed to find his voice. That's impossible. Is there anything else you need, Mrs. Parks? Kurt asked politely. That's all for now, thank you, I said, ending the call. The room remained frozen in stunned silence. Finally Karen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. $2.8 million. In Switzerland, I confirmed. Available immediately. But how? Laura began, then stopped, apparently unable to formulate the complete question. I've had that account for 30 years, I said simply. Since 1993, when I first realized that my family's love might be conditional. The barb hit its mark. John's face flushed red. That's not fair, Mom. We're trying to help you. Are you? I asked. Or are you trying to solve a problem as quickly and efficiently as possible? Before anyone could answer, there was a knock at the door. Janet, the social worker, entered with a warm smile that faltered slightly when she saw the tension in the room. Mrs. Parks, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday about your discharge options. She glanced around at my family's stunned faces. Is this a bad time? Actually, it's perfect timing, I said. Janet, I'd like you to meet my family, and I'd like them to hear about the arrangements I've made. Janet nodded professionally. Of course, Mrs. Parks has informed me that she has adequate financial resources to hire private care services. She's also exploring some international relocation options that would provide her with excellent medical support in a more culturally appealing setting. International relocation. John's voice cracked slightly. Switzerland has excellent programs for wealthy retirees, Janet explained. Mrs. Parks is well qualified for their retirement visa program. You're planning to move to Switzerland? Laura asked, her voice rising with panic. I'm considering it, I said calmly. The healthcare system is excellent, the quality of life is high, and I have established banking relationships there. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Karen demanded to know why I had hidden money from the family. John insisted that moving to Switzerland was impossible at my age. Laura worried about how she would visit me. Henry sat in stunned silence, processing the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about our family's financial situation. The discharge paperwork is ready whenever you are, Mrs. Parks, Janet said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the commotion. You can sign yourself out at any time. I think I'll do that now, I said, reaching for the call button to summon a nurse. Mom, wait, John said desperately. You can't just leave. We need to discuss this. We've been discussing it for 3 days, I replied. You've made your position clear. Now I'm making mine. As the nurse arrived to help me with the discharge process, my family stood in shocked silence, finally understanding that the helpless old woman they had been planning to warehouse was actually the most financially independent person in the room. I'll be in touch, I said, as I signed the final discharge papers. Once I've decided where I want to spend my remaining years, for the next 2 weeks, I disappeared from my family's reach, as completely as if I had vanished into thin air. The private care service I had hired through my Swiss banking connections was more than just medical support. They were experts in discretion and privacy protection for wealthy clients who valued their independence. I had checked into the Meridian Recovery Suites, an exclusive medical facility that catered to affluent patients seeking privacy during their recuperation. To my family, I had simply vanished from the hospital and could not be located anywhere in the local healthcare system. From my luxurious suite overlooking the city, I monitored my family's increasingly frantic attempts to find me through a private investigator I had hired to keep tabs on their activities. What I learned was both amusing and revealing. John had started with the methodical approach, calling every assisted living facility within a 50-mile radius. When that proved fruitless, he contacted hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and even hotels, becoming increasingly agitated when none of them had any record of a Dolly Parks. She can't have just disappeared, I heard him telling Laura during one of their daily crisis meetings at my empty house, which the investigator had bugged with listening devices. Someone has to know where she is. Maybe she really did hire private care, Laura suggested hesitantly. Maybe she's staying somewhere we don't know about. With what money? Karen's voice was sharp with frustration. That phone call had to be some kind of scam. There's no way Mom has millions of dollars hidden away. But doubt was creeping into their voices. I could hear it in the way they questioned their own assumptions, the way they kept returning to the impossible figure Kurt had confirmed, $2.8 million. By the end of the first week, they had hired a private investigator of their own, a considerably less sophisticated operation than the one I employed. Their investigator, a man named Peterson, spent most of his time checking obvious places, local banks, real estate offices, travel agencies. He never thought to look at exclusive medical facilities or international banking institutions. Peterson found something, John announced during their second week of searching, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and desperation. There's a record of Mom making international phone calls from the hospital, multiple calls to Switzerland. Switzerland? Henry's voice was puzzled. Why would she be calling Switzerland? Banking, Karen said grimly. She really does have money there, doesn't she? The admission hung in the air like a confession of their own short-sightedness. They were finally beginning to accept that their elderly mother had resources and capabilities they had never imagined. We need to find her, Laura said, her voice tinged with panic. What if something happens to her? What if she's hurt and alone somewhere? It was interesting how their concern for my well-being only emerged after they realized they couldn't control my choices. When they thought I was helpless and dependent, their priority had been efficient disposal. Now that they understood I had options, they suddenly cared about my safety. She's punishing us, John said bitterly during their third week of fruitless searching. This is all some elaborate revenge for the nursing home discussions. Can you blame her? Henry asked quietly, surprising everyone with his directness. We basically decided to warehouse her without asking what she wanted. We were trying to help her, Karen protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Were we? Henry continued. Or were we trying to solve a problem as efficiently as possible? I smiled as I listened to this exchange through my investigator's recording equipment. Henry had always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, and it seemed that my disappearance had finally prompted him to examine their behavior honestly. The point is, John said, steering the conversation back to practical matters, we need to find her. She's 74 years old, recovering from surgery, and apparently making major financial decisions without proper advice. Proper advice from whom? Henry asked. From us, the same people who wanted to sell her house and put her in a nursing home. That's different, Laura interjected. That was about her safety. No, Henry said with growing certainty, that was about our convenience. The silence that followed this observation was telling. Even through the recording I could sense their discomfort with the truth Henry had voiced. By the fourth week, their search had taken on a desperate quality. They had contacted the police, who politely explained that a competent adult choosing not to contact family members was not a criminal matter. They had called every financial institution in the region, only to be told that customer information was confidential. They had even reached out to the State Department, wondering if I had somehow left the country. She could be anywhere, Laura said, during what I had come to think of as their daily crisis meeting. She could be in Switzerland for all we know. The irony was that Switzerland was exactly where I was planning to go, but not yet. First, I wanted to complete my recovery in comfort and privacy, watch my family struggle with the consequences of their assumptions, and finalize the arrangements that would give me the ultimate freedom to choose my own future. We have to face the possibility, John said heavily, that she doesn't want to be found, that she's perfectly capable of taking care of herself, and has chosen to cut us out of her life. Because we treated her like a burden, Henry added quietly. She'll come back, Karen said, but she sounded less certain with each passing day. She has to come back eventually, but I had no intention of coming back, at least, not as the helpless dependent woman they thought they knew. When I finally revealed myself to them again, it would be as someone entirely different, a woman with resources, options, and the power to choose exactly how much contact she wanted with family members who had proven their love was conditional. From my recovery suite, I placed another call to Kurt in Geneva. I'm ready to move forward with the relocation plans, I told him. How soon can we arrange the transfer? Excellent timing, Mrs. Parks, Kurt replied, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a banker who specialized in complex international relocations. We've identified several properties that would suit your requirements perfectly. The paperwork for your residence permit is nearly complete, and our medical concierge service has arranged partnerships with Switzerland's finest healthcare facilities. Over the following weeks, while my family continued their futile search, I embarked on the most empowering chapter of my adult life. From my recovery suite, I orchestrated a complete transformation of my existence with the efficiency that only substantial financial resources could provide. The first property Kurt showed me virtually was a stunning 3-bedroom chalet in Montreux, overlooking Lake Geneva with the Alps as a backdrop. The second was a modern apartment in Lucerne, with floor-to-ceiling windows and access to world-class medical facilities. But it was the third option that captured my imagination completely. A renovated 19th century villa in the hills above Lausanne, complete with a caretaker's cottage and gardens that reminded me of the sanctuary I had always dreamed of creating. The villa comes fully staffed, Kurt explained during our video tour. The previous owner was a retired American pharmaceutical executive who established excellent relationships with local healthcare providers, domestic staff, and the expatriate community. You would be inheriting a complete support system. As my physical strength returned and my surgical scars healed, I found myself energized by possibilities I had never imagined. This wasn't just about escaping my family's low expectations, it was about finally living the life I had always wanted but never believed I deserved. I'll take the villa, I told Kurt during our 4th week of virtual meetings, and I'd like to accelerate the timeline. How quickly can we complete the transaction? Given your financial qualifications and the fact that you're purchasing outright, we could have you relocated within 6 weeks, Kurt replied. Shall I arrange for the documentation process to begin immediately? While Kurt handled the legal and financial aspects of my Swiss relocation, I worked with Dr. Nathaniel, who had been checking on my recovery with house calls to the Meridian facility. My progress had exceeded all his expectations. Remarkable healing for someone your age, he observed during one of his visits. Whatever you're doing differently from typical recovery protocols, it's working extraordinarily well. What I was doing differently was simple. For the first time in decades, I was living without the constant stress of managing other people's expectations and disappointments. The luxury of focusing entirely on my own well-being, supported by excellent medical care, and freed from family drama, had accelerated my recovery in ways that no medication could have achieved. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the evolution of my relationship with money itself. For 30 years, the Swiss account had been my secret safety net, quietly growing but rarely accessed. Now I was learning to wield financial independence as the powerful tool it truly was. I'd like to establish a charitable foundation, I told Kurt during one of our planning sessions. Something focused on supporting elderly individuals who find themselves in situations similar to mine, people whose families are making decisions based on convenience rather than genuine care. An excellent idea, Kurt agreed. Switzerland has very favorable laws for charitable foundations. We could establish it as part of your residency documentation, which would also provide certain tax advantages. The foundation became my passion project during recovery. Through my Swiss banking connections, I researched organizations that provided legal advocacy for elderly people facing unwanted guardianship proceedings, financial services for seniors who wanted to maintain independence, and even relocation assistance for older adults seeking to escape toxic family dynamics. We could start with an initial endowment of $500,000, I proposed to Kurt. That would allow us to help approximately 50 people per year while building the foundation's operational capacity. As I planned my new life, I also received regular updates from my private investigator about my family's increasingly desperate search efforts. The recordings revealed a fascinating psychological shift. As their certainty about my helplessness crumbled, their respect for my capabilities grew proportionally. I keep thinking about that phone call, Laura admitted during one of their meetings. $2.8 million. How did she accumulate that much money without any of us knowing? She was married to Dad for 45 years, Henry pointed out. Maybe she was better with money than we ever realized. But we would have known, John insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than before. We handled their finances after Dad got sick. No, Henry corrected him. We handled the finances we knew about. Apparently, there were things Mom kept private. Karen's voice was thoughtful when she finally spoke. You know what bothers me most? Not that she had secret money, but that she felt she needed to keep it secret from us. What does that say about our relationship with her? The question hung in the air unanswered, but I could hear the beginning of genuine self-reflection in her voice. Perhaps my disappearance was accomplishing more than just securing my independence. It was forcing my family to examine their own behavior and assumptions. By the 6th week of my recovery and planning, I had transformed from a helpless surgery patient into the orchestrator of an international relocation. My new Swiss identity documents were being processed, my villa purchase was in escrow, and my charitable foundation had received preliminary approval from Swiss authorities. Most importantly, I had rediscovered myself as a woman of substance, capability, and independence. The person who would eventually contact my family would bear little resemblance to the elderly woman they had dismissed as a burden 6 weeks earlier. Everything is in place, Mrs. Parks, Kurt informed me during our final preparatory call. Your villa will be ready for occupancy in 2 weeks. Your staff has been briefed on your arrival, and your foundation paperwork will be completed shortly after you take residence. As I prepared for the next phase of my plan, the dramatic re-emergence that would shatter my family's assumptions once and for all, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed. I was no longer hiding my capabilities or minimizing my accomplishments to make others comfortable. Tomorrow I would begin the process of saying goodbye to the woman who had spent decades accommodating other people's limitations, and hello to the woman who was finally ready to live entirely on her own terms. After 7 weeks of complete silence, I decided it was time to make contact with my family, but this wouldn't be a humble return asking for forgiveness or understanding. Instead, I would orchestrate my re-emergence with the same precision I had used to plan my Swiss relocation. I arranged to meet them at the Cascade Hotel's executive conference room, neutral territory that I had reserved under my name, paid for with my Swiss banking card, and chosen specifically for its intimidating atmosphere of wealth and power. The mahogany-paneled room overlooked the city's financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. When my family arrived, punctual to the minute as I had expected, they found me already seated at the head of the polished conference table, dressed in an elegant navy suit I had purchased during my recovery. I had lost weight during my ordeal, but rather than appearing frail, I looked refined and sophisticated in a way that clearly caught them off guard. Mom, Laura's voice was tentative as she stepped into the room, followed by John, Karen, and Henry. We've been so worried about you. Have you? I asked calmly, gesturing to the chairs arranged around the table. Please, sit down. We have a great deal to discuss. They settled into their seats with obvious uncertainty, their eyes taking in the expensive surroundings and my transformed appearance. Gone was the hospital patient in a medical gown. In her place sat a woman who commanded attention and respect. Where have you been? John demanded, though his usual authoritative tone was tempered by confusion. We've been searching for 7 weeks. We hired investigators, contacted hospitals. I've been recovering, I interrupted smoothly. In a private medical facility that specializes in discretion and excellent care. Exactly the kind of care I told you I could afford, and exactly the kind you assured me was financially impossible. Karen leaned forward, her expression sharp with curiosity. What kind of facility, and how did you pay for it? I smiled slightly. The kind that caters to individuals with substantial assets who value their privacy. As for payment, I believe I've already demonstrated that my financial resources exceed your assumptions. Henry was studying my face intently. You look different, Mom. Stronger. I feel different, I acknowledged. 7 weeks of living according to my own preferences, rather than accommodating everyone else's limitations, has been remarkably rejuvenating. We were trying to help you, Laura protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Were you? I asked, echoing the same question Henry had posed during one of their recorded conversations. Or were you trying to solve a problem as efficiently as possible? The silence that followed told me they recognized the phrase, and the implication that I somehow knew about their private discussions. I've made some decisions during my recovery. I continued, placing a manila folder on the table. Decisions about my future that I wanted to share with you before implementing them. John reached for the folder, but I placed my hand over it firmly. Not yet. First, I want to understand something. Do any of you have any idea why I might have felt the need to maintain financial independence separate from the family? They exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Mom, Henry said carefully, we never meant to make you feel like you couldn't trust us with your financial information. Didn't you? I asked. John, you used power of attorney documents to investigate my finances without my permission. Karen, you researched nursing facilities and calculated how long my money would last before I was even discharged from the hospital. Laura, you scheduled facility tours without asking if I wanted to visit them. None of you considered that I might have my own preferences or capabilities. We were worried about your safety, John said defensively. No, I replied firmly. You were worried about your convenience. My safety would have involved asking what I wanted and exploring options that honored my autonomy. Your convenience required efficiency and minimal disruption to your schedules. Karen's face was flushed with anger. That's not fair. Dolly, we have jobs, responsibilities, families of our own, and I have the right to make my own decisions about my own life. I interrupted. Which brings me to the reason for this meeting. I opened the folder and spread several documents across the table: property deeds, bank statements, foundation paperwork, and Swiss residency permits. I'm moving to Switzerland, I announced calmly. I've purchased a villa in Lausanne, established Swiss residency, and founded a charitable organization that will be my primary focus for whatever years I have remaining. The room erupted in overlapping voices, protests, questions, demands for explanation. I let them express their shock and dismay for several minutes before raising my hand for silence. The villa is beautiful, I continued, as if they hadn't spoken. 3 bedrooms, 2 acres of gardens, full staff, and access to some of the world's finest medical care. I'll be perfectly comfortable and completely independent. Mom, you can't just move to Switzerland, Laura said desperately. You don't speak the language, you don't know anyone there. I speak enough French for daily communication, and my banking relationships have provided excellent introductions to the expatriate community. I replied, as for knowing people, I'm looking forward to making new friends who see me as I am rather than as they assume me to be. What about us? Henry asked quietly. What about your family? I studied his face, seeing genuine pain in his expression. Of all my children, Henry seemed to understand the gravity of what they had lost through their treatment of me. That, I said softly, depends entirely on whether you're willing to build a relationship with the woman I actually am, rather than the helpless burden you assumed me to be. The weight of my words settled over the room like a shroud. For the first time in our family's history, I held all the power, and they were the ones who needed something from me. When do you leave? John asked finally, his voice hollow. 3 weeks, I replied. Unless, of course, you can give me a compelling reason to reconsider. The silence that followed my announcement stretched painfully long. I watched my family process the full scope of what I had accomplished during my 7-week absence. Not just recovering from surgery, but orchestrating an entire life transformation that rendered their nursing home plans obsolete. How much? Karen asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. How much money do you really have? I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. The Swiss account currently holds approximately $2.9 million, including recent investment growth. But that's not the full picture. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew additional documents. Harold's life insurance policy from 1993 paid out $20,000. You never knew about it because he had designated me as the sole beneficiary on a separate policy he maintained independently. That money became the seed capital for 30 years of careful international investing. John's face had gone pale. 30 years? You've been hiding money from the family for 30 years? I've been maintaining financial independence for 30 years? I corrected. There's a significant difference. But why? Laura's voice cracked with genuine confusion. Why didn't you trust us? I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Do you remember 1995 when Harold wanted to buy that boat? The $30,000 sailboat he claimed we couldn't afford? Vaguely, Henry said. He spent weeks explaining to you children why it was fiscally irresponsible, how our family budget couldn't support such a luxury. But 2 months later, when his business partner offered him a chance to invest in that strip mall development, Harold found the money immediately, borrowed against our house, to make it happen. I turned back to face them. That's when I realized that we can't afford it really meant that's not Harold's priority. And I began to wonder what would happen if I ever needed something that wasn't Harold's priority. Dad provided for you, John protested. Harold provided for Harold, I said gently. I was an extension of his priorities, not a person with my own financial agency. When he became ill, you all stepped naturally into that same dynamic. I remained an extension of other people's decisions about what was appropriate for me. Karen's expression had shifted from anger to something approaching understanding. So you kept the money secret as insurance. I kept it secret because 30 years of family dynamics taught me that my needs would always be secondary to everyone else's convenience. And the surgery proved me right. I returned to my seat and opened the final document in my folder. This is the trust structure I've established for my estate. The Swiss villa, the foundation, the remaining liquid assets, everything has been arranged to ensure my financial independence for the rest of my life. What about our inheritance? John asked, his voice tight. The question hung in the air like a mission of their true priorities. Even now, faced with the reality of losing their mother to another continent, their immediate concern was financial. Your inheritance, I said slowly, depends entirely on the relationship we build from this point forward. The current estate plan leaves everything to the foundation, but that can be changed if you demonstrate that you see me as a person worth knowing, rather than a burden to be managed. Laura began to cry quietly. Mom, we never meant to hurt you. I know, I said softly. But intent doesn't erase impact. You treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a parent to be respected. Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. What would it take? What would it take for you to stay? The question I had been waiting for. The moment when they finally asked what I wanted instead of telling me what they thought was best. It would take a fundamental change in how you see me, I replied. Not as elderly mom who needs managing, but as Dolly Parks, a woman with resources, intelligence, and the right to make her own choices, even choices you don't understand or approve of. The weight of my words settled over the room like a final judgment. For the first time in decades, my family was being forced to confront the reality of who I actually was, versus who they had assumed me to be. Mom, John began, his corporate composure finally cracking. I don't understand how we got here. We were trying to help you. No, John, I said firmly, my voice stronger than it had been in years. You were trying to control me. There's a profound difference between helping someone and managing them like a problem to be solved. I stood and walked around the table, addressing each of them directly. John, you used legal documents to investigate my finances without my consent, then presented your findings as evidence that I was incompetent to make my own decisions. That's not help, that's a power grab. John's face flushed red, but he didn't deny it. Karen, I continued, turning to my daughter-in-law, you calculated how long my money would last in a nursing home, before I was even discharged from surgery. You scheduled facility tours without asking if I wanted to visit them. You treated me like inventory to be efficiently warehoused. Karen opened her mouth to protest, then closed it, apparently realizing she had no defense. Laura, you worried constantly about how my care would disrupt your children's activities, but never once asked what kind of care I actually wanted or needed. My well-being was secondary to your scheduling convenience. Laura's tears were flowing freely now. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. And Henry, I said, my voice softening slightly as I faced my youngest, you saw what was happening. You knew it was wrong, but you said nothing because avoiding conflict was more comfortable than defending your mother. Henry looked stricken. You're right, I was a coward. I returned to my seat, looking at each of them in turn. Do you understand what you did? You took a woman who had just undergone surgery, a temporary vulnerability, and used it as justification to strip away her autonomy permanently. You didn't see a person who needed support. You saw a problem that needed to be eliminated. But we thought you couldn't afford proper care, Laura protested weakly. You thought wrong, I replied. But more importantly, you never asked. You investigated my known accounts and declared the matter settled without considering that there might be resources you didn't know about. You made assumptions and then acted on them as if they were facts. Why didn't you tell us about the money? Karen demanded, some of her earlier defensiveness returning. Because this moment proves exactly why I was right to keep it secret, I answered sharply. Even now, your first concern isn't that you misjudged my capabilities or disrespected my autonomy. Your first concern is that you didn't have complete access to my financial information. The silence that followed was deafening. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice taking on the authoritative tone they had never heard from me before. I'm going to Switzerland in 3 weeks. I've purchased a beautiful villa, established residency, and founded a charitable organization. I will live independently, comfortably, and with dignity.
Mom, please, Laura began. I'm not finished, I interrupted.
The question isn't whether I'm leaving. The question is whether any of you will be part of my new life. And that depends entirely on whether you can accept that I am not the helpless burden you assumed me to be. I gathered my documents and placed them back in the folder. I'll be staying at my house for the next 3 weeks, making final arrangements. If any of you want to rebuild our relationship based on mutual respect rather than your convenience, you know where to find me. What if we can't accept it? John asked quietly, his voice hollow.
What if we can't change?
I looked at my eldest son, this man I had raised from infancy, who had somehow grown into someone who could look at his mother and see only a management problem. Then you'll have made your choice, I replied simply, and I'll have made mine. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. For 30 years, I've accommodated your limitations, minimized my capabilities, and accepted being underestimated, because I thought that's what families did. I thought love meant making yourself smaller so others could feel bigger. I met each of their eyes one final time, but I'm 74 years old, and I don't have time to waste pretending to be less than I am to make other people comfortable. The woman who called me a burden is gone. The question is whether you're capable of knowing the woman who remains. The 3 weeks that followed our confrontation at the Cascade Hotel revealed my family's true character in ways that decades of normal interaction never could. Faced with the reality of losing me permanently, each of them responded according to their deepest nature. John, true to form, approached the situation like a business problem to be solved. He appeared at my door the very next morning with a manila folder of his own, containing what he called a comprehensive care plan that honors your autonomy while ensuring your safety. Mom, I've researched private care services, home modification contractors, and legal structures that would give you complete control while providing family support, he announced, spreading documents across my kitchen table with the same efficiency he brought to corporate presentations. I listened patiently as he outlined his proposal, a detailed system that would allow me to remain in my house with professional care, family involvement limited to weekly check-ins, and complete financial independence. It was thorough, well-researched, and completely missed the point. John, I said gently, when he finished. This is exactly what you did before. You've identified a problem, me leaving for Switzerland, and created a solution without asking what I actually want. His face fell, but I thought if I could prove I respected your independence. Respecting my independence means accepting my choice to move to Switzerland, not trying to engineer a better alternative, I explained. I don't need you to solve my problems. I need you to support my decisions. John left that day, looking defeated, and I didn't hear from him again for a week. Karen's response was more direct. She called to inform me that she thought my behavior was selfish and manipulative, and that she wouldn't be enabling this dramatic tantrum by pretending it's reasonable. You're abandoning your family over hurt feelings, she said, during our brief final phone conversation. Real adults work through problems instead of running away to Europe. I thanked her for clarifying her position, and hung up. Some relationships, I realized, were built on such fundamental disrespect that they couldn't be repaired. Laura surprised me. She arrived the second day with tears in her eyes, and a simple request: "Mom, can you teach me about the things I never knew about you?" We spent the afternoon looking through photo albums from my early career, discussing architectural principles, and talking about the investments I had made over the years. For the first time in our relationship, Laura seemed genuinely curious about who I was as a person, rather than just as her mother. "I always thought you gave up everything for us," she said, as we examined blueprints from a commercial project I had worked on before her birth. "I never realized you had your own dreams and expertise." "I did give up a lot," I admitted. "But that was my choice." What hurt was having that sacrifice interpreted as incompetence. Henry's response was the most meaningful. He simply showed up every morning for breakfast, not to discuss the Switzerland plan or negotiate alternatives, but to spend time with me. We talked about his work, his relationships, his concerns about the future. He asked about my foundation plans and expressed genuine interest in my Swiss villa. "I want to visit you," he said during our final breakfast together. "Not to convince you to come back, but because I'd like to see this new life you're building." It was the first time any of my children had expressed interest in my choices, rather than opposition to them. On the morning of my departure, I stood in my empty house on Maple Street for the last time. The movers had taken my selected belongings to storage, and everything else had been donated to charity. The house itself would be sold, with the proceeds going to my foundation. Only Henry had come to say goodbye. He arrived early, as promised, with coffee from our favorite bakery, and a quiet dignity that reminded me of who he had been as a child: thoughtful, sensitive, and brave when it mattered most. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me as we sat on the front porch, watching the sunrise paint the neighborhood in golden light. "About how love shouldn't require making yourself smaller." And I prompted gently. "I've been making myself smaller my whole life," he admitted. Avoiding conflict, staying neutral, letting other people make the difficult decisions. I thought that was being peaceful, but really it was just being weak. I reached over and took his hand. "It's never too late to change. Will you really be happy in Switzerland?" he asked. "Won't you miss us?" I considered the question carefully. "I'll miss the people you could have been if you'd seen me clearly. But I won't miss being treated like a burden or having my capabilities questioned every time I wanted to make my own choices." A taxi pulled up to the curb, my ride to the airport. Henry helped me with my carry-on bag, and we walked slowly to the waiting car. "Laura wanted to come," he said, as we reached the taxi, "but she was afraid she'd cry and make it harder for you." "Tell her I understand," I replied. "And tell her that the woman who taught her about architectural principles last week, that's who I've always been. I just forgot for a while." As the taxi pulled away, I watched Henry standing in front of the house where I had spent 15 years diminishing myself to accommodate other people's limitations. Through the rear window, I saw him waving until we turned the corner. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my villa in Lausanne, looking out over Lake Geneva at the Alps beyond. The foundation has helped 12 elderly people escape unwanted guardianship proceedings. I've made friends with expats who know me as Dolly Parks, philanthropist, art collector, and woman of independent means, rather than as someone's burden. Henry visited last month, and we spent a wonderful week hiking mountain trails and exploring local museums. He's filed for divorce from his wife, started his own consulting firm, and begun speaking up in family discussions. Laura sends weekly emails asking about my work and sharing pictures of her children. John has maintained his dignified silence, and Karen has apparently told people that I abandoned the family for money. They called me a burden after my surgery, but that crisis gave me something invaluable: the clarity to see that I had been carrying the real burden all along, the exhausting weight of other people's limitations and expectations. Sometimes the greatest gift life can give you is the moment when you realize you don't have to carry that weight anymore. At 74, I finally learned that love isn't about making yourself smaller. It's about having the courage to be exactly who you are, regardless of who finds that inconvenient. The Swiss sunrise through my villa windows reminds me every morning that it's never too late to choose yourself, and sometimes, that choice is the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.